He was carving a massive stone in his workshop and never expected to find a leather pouch hidden inside for more than 300 years. When he opened it, he realized he had made a terrible mistake. Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation, and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The morning crept into the workshop long before the town itself had fully woken. Pale mountain light slipped through the tall dusty windows, turning the air into a drifting haze of fine stone powder that never truly settled, no matter how often the floor was swept. The sculptor stood in the center of the space, with his sleeves rolled past the elbows, his palms wrapped around the cold steel of a gouge that had long ago lost any factory polish. His hands were thick, scarred, and permanently stained with gray dust that no amount of soap ever fully removed. Each swing of the mallet sent a dull reverberation through the massive block of stone he was shaping, a sound so deep and muted that it felt less like noise and more like pressure inside the chest. It was a sound he had known for most of his adult life, a sound that had become inseparable from his own heartbeat. He had learned to work in the quiet hours because the quiet suited him. The town lay still beyond the workshop walls, a sprawl of narrow streets and sagging storefronts pressed between mountains that once promised prosperity. Now they offered little more than scenery for passing travelers who rarely stopped long enough to notice the people who remained behind. He was one of those people. He had been born in this valley, had watched the last quarry close, the last diner shut its doors, and the last of his friends leave in search of steadier lives somewhere else. He stayed because stone did not leave. Stone endured, even when everything built upon it began to fail. He moved around the block, studying the natural veins that cut across its surface. To anyone else, the slab was just another chunk of granite dragged out of some forgotten pit, but to him it was already something more. He traced the faint lines with his fingertips, feeling where the grain changed direction, where the ancient pressure of the mountain had bent the minerals into hidden currents. He believed, with a conviction that bordered on superstition, that every stone carried a story in its body, compressed into it over centuries. His job was not to impose shape, but to uncover it, to free whatever was already waiting inside. This belief had not come from books or teachers. It had grown out of long years of trial, failure, and stubborn persistence. When he was younger, he had tried to be practical. He had taken whatever work the town could offer, unloading trucks, cleaning abandoned lots, repairing fences for farmers who paid him in cash they could barely spare. Sculpting had started as a distraction, a way to quiet the restless anger that seemed to sit permanently under his skin. He had found a broken chisel in the back of a closed quarry shed and begun hacking at discarded stones behind his mother's trailer. The first pieces were clumsy and heavy, but something in the act of cutting into something that had existed long before him felt like a conversation across time. When his mother passed and the trailer was sold, he took the few tools he had collected and rented a corner of this old warehouse, converting it into the workshop where he now stood. Years later, the town knew him as the man who carved rocks. Some said it with mild respect, others with a tone that suggested wasted potential. They saw his calloused hands and the dust that clung to his clothes even when he walked into the grocery store, and they shook their heads as though his choices were a private tragedy. He paid his bills late more often than not. There were weeks when he lived on canned beans and coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. The electricity for the heavy compressor and lights came at a cost he could never fully keep up with, and the landlord's notices were a regular fixture taped crookedly to his door. Still, he worked. He worked because when he stopped, the silence became unbearable. The workshop was not only his place of labor but his refuge, a place where he could forget the thin envelope of money in his pocket and the unopened letters stacked on the shelf by the door. He told himself that stone would outlast debt, that the mountains had no concept of overdue payments. Outside the building, the town moved slowly into another day. A delivery truck rattled past, its sides plastered with faded advertisements for businesses that no longer existed. The road that cut through the valley had been widened twice in the last decade, each expansion eating away at old hillsides and pushing more debris into the ravines below. He sometimes collected his material from those places, from the piles of discarded rock that were left behind when the crews packed up. He had made a quiet arrangement with one of the drivers who worked those sites, a man who would call him whenever a load of stone was deemed too awkward or worthless to haul away. For a few dollars and a case of beer, he could pick through the remains and take whatever caught his eye. That arrangement had kept him supplied with material, but it had not kept him solvent. Orders were rare, and when they came, they were usually small, decorative pieces that sold for barely more than the cost of the tools he used to make them. He had begun to suspect that his reputation as an eccentric local artisan worked against him more than it helped. People wanted souvenirs, not sculptures carved from the bones of the land. He was wiping his brow with the back of his forearm when the phone on the cluttered workbench vibrated. The screen lit up with a number he did not recognize. He let it ring once, twice, before setting the mallet down and answering. The voice on the other end was smooth and impatient, asking if he was the man who specialized in large-scale stone carving, the one who sourced material directly from the mountains. The caller spoke as though this were a rare and valuable skill rather than a necessity born of poverty. They did not linger on pleasantries. The man said he represented a private collector interested in commissioning a piece from a single unbroken boulder, one that had recently been extracted during road expansion work in a nearby gorge. The payment, he mentioned, was enough to make the sculptor momentarily forget the dust in his lungs. It was more than he had earned in the past year combined, enough to clear his debts and maybe even replace the aging compressor that wheezed like a dying animal. There were conditions. The collector wanted the sculpture completed within a tight window, and he insisted on minimal documentation during the process. He did not want photos posted or progress shared, only the finished piece delivered to a specified address. The stone itself, he explained, was already being transported and would arrive within days. The sculptor listened, his free hand resting on the cold surface of the block he had been shaping all morning. Something about the call felt off, though he could not immediately say why. Perhaps it was the urgency, or the way the man avoided naming the collector directly, or the strange emphasis he placed on the origin of the stone. Yet the number he had quoted echoed in the sculptor's mind, bright as a flare in the darkness of his usual calculations. When the call ended, he stood alone in the quiet workshop, the early light now stronger, illuminating the fine cracks in the concrete floor and the long shelf where his finished pieces gathered dust. He imagined paying off the landlord, imagined buying fresh food without counting coins, imagined, for the first time in years, not worrying about how the next month would unfold. He told himself that a stone was a stone, no matter who paid for its shape, and that he would be a fool to refuse. He returned to his work with renewed intensity, though the sound of the mallet striking the gouge had changed. It no longer felt like a part of a familiar rhythm, but like the ticking of a clock he had not known was running. The mountains outside remained unmoved, ancient and patient, while inside the workshop a decision had been made that would soon draw something out of the stone far older and heavier than any debt he had ever carried. The promise of money hung over the workshop like a second ceiling, invisible but heavy enough to bend every thought beneath it. For the next 2 days, the sculptor found himself glancing at his phone between blows of the mallet, half expecting the unknown number to vanish as suddenly as it had appeared. He replayed the conversation again and again in his mind, trying to decide whether he had imagined the edge in the caller's voice or whether it had truly been there, concealed behind practiced politeness. He had agreed to the commission too quickly, he realized, yet in the same breath he knew there was no real alternative. The town did not reward hesitation, and neither did debt. The truck arrived early on the third morning, long before the sun had cleared the ridgeline. Its engine growled through the narrow streets, a sound that startled dogs into barking and pulled a few curious faces to their windows. The sculptor was already waiting outside, a thermos of bitter coffee in his hand, his breath visible in the chill air. When the vehicle finally rumbled to a stop in front of the workshop, he saw at once that this was not one of the battered flatbeds he was used to dealing with. This truck was new, its paint unscuffed, the company logo deliberately nondescript. The driver did not introduce himself. He climbed down from the cab, handed over a set of documents, and began loosening the heavy straps that secured the load. The stone emerged slowly as the tarpaulin was peeled back, and the sculptor felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. The boulder was enormous, easily twice the size of anything he had worked on before, and its surface bore the marks of violent extraction. Fresh scars cut across ancient weathering, and in places the stone was still dark with moisture from the gorge where it had been pulled free. It was not the color or the mass that caught his attention, however, but the peculiar way the surface seemed to fold inward along one flank, as though something beneath had once resisted the pressure that shaped it. The driver helped him guide the winch as the boulder was eased down onto the reinforced concrete pad he had prepared inside the workshop. The metal cables sang under the strain, echoing against the bare walls. When the stone finally settled, the sound it made was not the dull thud he expected, but a hollow-sounding thrum that vibrated faintly through the soles of his boots. He pretended not to notice the sensation, but it lingered with him long after the driver had collected his paperwork and disappeared back down the street without a backward glance. He circled the boulder in silence, his coffee forgotten on the bench by the door. The stone smelled faintly of wet earth and mineral dust, a scent he had come to associate with freshly disturbed ground. He pressed his palm against the surface, feeling the cold seep into his skin, and tried to imagine what shape might already be hiding inside. The caller had been vague about the subject of the sculpture, only insisting that it be large and left to the sculptor's discretion. The freedom should have felt exhilarating, yet standing before this massive, unfamiliar presence, he felt as though he were trespassing. He spent the rest of the morning examining the boulder, mapping its natural lines with charcoal, marking areas where the grain shifted or the texture changed. He had learned long ago that a stone could betray its weaknesses if one only paid enough attention. There were faint irregularities on the lower left side, almost invisible unless the light struck them at a shallow angle. When he tapped that area with the wooden handle of his mallet, the sound was different, not quite hollow, but muted in a way that set his teeth on edge. He told himself it was nothing, the product of internal stresses or pockets of softer mineral that would make carving easier. Still, he circled back to that spot more than once, tracing the outline of the anomaly as though memorizing it. By afternoon, the caller was on the phone again, his voice as smooth as before, his questions pointed. He wanted to know how the stone had arrived, whether it was intact, whether the sculptor had begun yet. The man spoke with a proprietary interest that made the sculptor bristle, yet he answered carefully, aware that any hint of trouble could jeopardize the only real opportunity he had been offered in years. He mentioned the size, the condition, the potential, and omitted his unease. The caller seemed satisfied but insisted on regular updates, a demand that felt less like business practice and more like surveillance. When the call ended, the sculptor leaned back against the workbench and closed his eyes. He tried to summon the old excitement that used to accompany a new project, the sense of standing at the edge of something unformed. Instead, he felt a dull pressure building behind his temples. He wondered, not for the first time, what kind of collector would commission a piece of this scale and then refuse to attach his own name to it. He wondered what interest such a person might have in a single boulder torn from a gorge that had no known quarries or landmarks of note. That evening, he did not go home when the light began to fade. He stayed with the stone, switching on the harsh overhead lamps that turned the workshop into a white cavern of glare and shadow. The boulder threw long distorted shapes across the walls, and he found himself walking its perimeter again and again, running his fingers along the shallow depressions and sudden ridges that marked its surface. At one point, he placed his ear against the stone and tapped lightly a few inches away. The sound traveled through it in strange ways, sometimes ringing clear, sometimes dying almost immediately, as though the interior were layered with chambers of different density. He laughed softly at himself, the sound lost in the vast room. He had been working alone too long, he decided. Isolation made men see patterns where none existed. Yet the feeling persisted that the boulder was not as solid as it pretended to be. He marked the area of the odd resonance with a thin line of chalk, telling himself that he would begin there in the morning. It was as good a starting point as any. The night grew colder, and eventually he locked the workshop and walked the few blocks back to his small rented house. Sleep did not come easily. His mind returned again and again to the hollow sound the stone had made when it settled on the pad, to the faint damp smell that clung to it, to the urgency in the caller's voice. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of standing in the gorge, watching as the mountainside split open, not with the roar of explosives, but with a quiet tearing, like cloth being pulled apart, revealing darkness that had been waiting there long before any road had cut its way through the valley. He woke before dawn, dressed without turning on the lights, and headed back to the workshop with a resolve that felt more like compulsion. The stone was there, unchanged in the pale pre-morning glow, yet it seemed to dominate the space in a way it had not the day before. He placed his tools on the bench with ritual care, choosing a fresh gouge and the mallet with the least splintered handle. As he set the tip of the steel against the chalk mark he had drawn, he hesitated only a moment before striking, unaware that this first controlled blow would soon open a path not just into the heart of the boulder, but into a story the mountains had kept sealed for centuries. The first strike landed with the familiar weight of practice behind it, the mallet driving the steel into the chalked mark with a clean, decisive blow. The sound that followed was not what the sculptor expected. Instead of the dense, ringing crack that granite usually produced, the boulder answered with a hollow note, low and oddly short, as though the energy of the impact had been swallowed before it could echo back. He froze, mallet still raised, and waited for the delayed tremor that often followed a deep cut. It never came. The gouge slid forward in his grip, sinking farther than it should have, disappearing into the stone as if the rock had momentarily turned to clay. A fine mist of gray dust puffed outward, carrying with it a scent that did not belong in a dry workshop. It was sharp and resinous, mingled with something loamy and old, like the air trapped inside a sealed cellar. He pulled the tool free and stared at the narrow slit it had opened. The edges were smooth, too smooth, as though the interior surface had been shaped rather than fractured. His pulse thudded in his ears, and he became suddenly aware of how loud his own breathing sounded in the empty room. He leaned closer, angling the portable lamp so that its beam cut into the darkness behind the opening. The light did not vanish as it should have against solid stone. It spilled inward, revealing a shallow curve that suggested a space beyond, a cavity deliberately hollowed rather than the random pocket of air sometimes left behind by geological processes. The walls glistened faintly, coated with a thin layer of hardened substance that caught the light like varnish. He straightened and forced himself to step back, to regard the boulder from a distance. The chalk mark looked insignificant now, a pale scratch on an enormous body that had just betrayed a secret. He considered, for a long moment, the possibility that this was a trick of the stone, some freak anomaly that would make sense once he widened the opening. Yet everything about the cavity, from the smoothness of its interior to the smell seeping from it, spoke of intention. Working with a care that bordered on reverence, he exchanged the gouge for a smaller, finer chisel. Each tap was measured, more suggestion than force, the steel nibbling at the edges of the slit until the opening widened enough for him to see further inside. He brushed away the accumulating dust with a soft paintbrush normally reserved for finished pieces, revealing a shallow bowl carved into the rock, its surface sealed with a dark, glossy layer that had once been pliable and was now brittle with age. The realization came slowly, like the lifting of fog. This was not a crack formed by pressure or frost. Someone had carved this. Someone had stood in this gorge centuries ago and hollowed out a chamber in the living rock, then closed it off with care and skill. His workshop, his debts, even the promised money from the mysterious caller receded into insignificance beside that thought. He became acutely aware of the weight of the boulder looming over him, the possibility that disturbing it further might cause fractures he could not control. The stone was massive, and any misjudged blow could collapse the cavity or send a fissure racing through the block, destroying whatever lay hidden inside. He fetched wooden wedges and inserted them gently into the widening slit, creating just enough tension to hold the opening without forcing it. The smell grew stronger as the cavity was exposed, filling the workshop with an aroma of ancient resin and trapped earth. He felt a strange reluctance to inhale too deeply, as though the air itself were a part of what had been preserved. He angled the lamp again, and this time the beam illuminated something dark and curved lying within the hollow. It was not part of the stone. Its surface was uneven, matte rather than mineral, and it absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. His hands trembled as he reached inside, stopping short of touching the object. He withdrew them again, pressing his palms against his thighs to steady himself. He told himself that he needed to be methodical, that curiosity had no place here. The voice of the caller echoed faintly in his memory, the insistence on discretion, on minimal documentation. For the first time he wondered if the man had known, not in vague terms but specifically, what this boulder concealed. He widened the opening another fraction of an inch, enough to slip 2 fingers inside and feel the object's edge. It was firm, yet faintly pliant, the texture unmistakably organic. Leather, he thought, though he could not imagine how leather might survive sealed within stone for so long. His heart pounded harder, a mix of fear and exhilaration that made his vision pulse at the edges. He drew back and closed his eyes, forcing himself to think. This was not a treasure hunt or a strange curiosity to be bragged about in the local bar. Whatever this was, it had been hidden deliberately, and he had no right to tear it free in a moment of impulsive excitement. He remembered the way the caller had stressed the origin of the stone, the urgency in his tone. If the man knew about this, then the commission was not about art at all. It was about retrieving something that had never been meant to see daylight again. The thought unsettled him deeply. He had lived most of his life with little more than his hands and his tools, but he had never considered himself a thief. The idea that he might be unwittingly complicit in stealing from the past made his stomach knot. He resolved, then and there, not to inform the caller of what he had found, at least not yet. He needed time, and perhaps help, before anyone else could lay claim to the secret he had uncovered. He turned off the compressor and let the workshop fall into a quieter state, the silence broken only by the distant murmur of traffic from the main road. He fetched a roll of heavy canvas and draped it loosely over the exposed area of the boulder, hiding the slit from casual view. It was a flimsy measure, but it made him feel marginally safer, as though concealing the opening could also conceal his growing unease. Returning to the cavity, he used the brush to clear the remaining dust and peered inside one last time before stopping for the day. The dark object lay cradled in the carved bowl, its curved surface barely visible beyond the lip of stone. It looked too large to have slipped in by accident, too carefully positioned to be debris. He imagined the hands that had placed it there, the deliberation behind, sealing it away, and he felt an odd surge of connection across the centuries. When he finally locked up the workshop, the town had fully awakened. People went about their errands unaware that a fragment of buried history now sat a few feet from the sidewalk behind a corrugated metal door. He walked home with his head down, his mind replaying every detail of the discovery. He did not yet know what lay inside the leather form he had glimpsed, but he knew, with a certainty that felt like a weight on his chest, that whatever it was, it had been entrusted to the mountain itself for safekeeping. And he had just broken the seal. The night that followed his discovery passed without rest. He lay in his narrow bed, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sigh of wind moving through the valley, but beneath those familiar sounds ran a deeper current of unease. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw again the smooth curve of the object nestled inside the stone, the way the light had barely touched it, the impossibility of leather surviving in such a place unless it had been protected with deliberate care. He rose before dawn and returned to the workshop with a feeling that he was stepping into territory that no longer belonged to him. The canvas still hung where he had left it, dull and formless against the bulk of the boulder. He drew it aside and stood for several minutes without moving, simply confirming that nothing had changed in his absence. The slit remained narrow, the wedges holding the tension just as he had set them. The smell was fainter now, but it returned as soon as he leaned close, a whisper of resin and old soil that seemed to breathe out from the rock itself. He gathered what he needed with deliberate slowness, as though haste might anger whatever lay concealed. Soft wooden prees, thin metal spatulas, lengths of padded cord, tools not for carving but for extraction. He spoke no words aloud, yet his movements were accompanied by an internal murmur of caution that had little to do with professional pride and everything to do with respect. The opening widened by fractions of an inch at a time. Each adjustment brought the hidden chamber further into the light, revealing more of its shape. It was not a crude hollow hacked in desperation. The interior walls curved smoothly, the edges softened by a coating that had once been viscous and was now hardened into a dark lacquer. The layer bore faint lines where fingers or primitive tools had once passed over it, smoothing, sealing, preparing. Whoever had made this place had known that the stone itself was not enough, that the air and moisture would need to be kept out, that the cavity had to become a vessel rather than a wound. At last, the object within lay exposed. It was a pouch, larger than he had expected, its body sagging slightly under its own weight. The leather was darkened almost to black, its surface uneven where time had puckered it. The seams were stitched with what looked like sinew, each knot sunk deep and then flooded with resin that had spread and hardened into amber ridges. Along one side he could just make out markings pressed into the hide, shapes worn shallow by centuries, yet still distinct enough to suggest intent rather than decoration. He wrapped padded cords around the pouch, threading them carefully beneath its bulk so that no single point would bear too much strain. The first attempt to lift it failed. It was heavier than any bundle of leather had a right to be, dense with whatever it contained. The second attempt succeeded only when he braced himself against the boulder, the muscles in his back and shoulders burning as he coaxed the pouch free of its cradle. When it finally came away, the empty cavity yawned behind it, a curved darkness that seemed almost wounded without its occupant. He lowered the pouch onto a table he had cleared and covered with clean cloth, stepping back to assess it from a safer distance. It looked out of place in the workshop, too old, too deliberate to belong among the half-finished sculptures and dusty tools. He photographed it from every angle. The symbols, the seams, the patches where the resin had pooled and cracked. Then he took measurements, noting the length, the width, the uneven bulge that suggested rigid shapes inside. He did all this not as a craftsman, but as someone who had watched enough documentaries to know that evidence mattered. A part of him wondered whether he was already too late, whether the simple act of removing the pouch from its stone chamber had irreversibly altered whatever story it carried. The question of age nagged at him. He turned his attention back to the boulder, to the place where the cavity had been hidden. The exterior surface bore no sign of repair, no obvious plug or seam. The stone around the opening was weathered, its edges softened in a way that spoke of decades of exposure, perhaps more. He fetched a magnifying glass and studied the boundary between the sealed interior and the surrounding rock. The coating extended a short distance into the stone, filling microscopic pores, fusing itself to the mineral structure. This was not a matter of years. It was the work of centuries, of chemistry and pressure combining to erase the distinction between natural and crafted surfaces. He imagined the moment when the pouch had been placed inside. The rock must have been part of a cliff then, the cavity carved into its face before being sealed and left to the slow violence of time. Landslides, erosion, human interference had eventually torn the stone free, turning a deliberate sanctuary into an anonymous boulder that could be hauled away by a road crew without anyone suspecting what lay inside. His phone vibrated on the bench, shattering the stillness. The same number, the same insistence. He did not answer at first, watching the screen pulse itself dark again. When it lit a second time, he forced himself to pick up. The caller did not bother with greetings. He wanted to know how the work was progressing, whether the sculptor had begun shaping the stone. The man's tone was cordial, but beneath it ran a strain that the sculptor could now recognize. He answered in generalities, speaking of surface assessment and preparation, of needing time to understand the structure of such a large piece. He said nothing of hollow chambers or ancient pouches. When the call ended, his hands were damp with sweat. He locked the workshop doors, something he had rarely bothered to do during the day, and moved the pouch out of sight, sliding it into a storage cabinet behind a row of unfinished figures. The action felt absurdly inadequate, yet it was all he could think to do. He returned to the boulder and replaced the canvas, though he knew the gesture was symbolic at best. He spent the rest of the afternoon in the local library, his hands still faintly smelling of resin despite repeated washing. The library was one of the few public spaces left that still felt cared for, its shelves heavy with regional histories that few bothered to consult anymore. He searched for anything that might resemble the markings he had seen on the pouch, leafing through volumes on indigenous art and settlement patterns in the surrounding mountains. The shapes were not exact, but the style was unmistakable, echoing motifs associated with tribes that had once occupied the high valleys before being driven out or absorbed. The realization settled over him slowly, and then all at once. This was not merely old. It was culturally specific, tied to people whose stories had been interrupted or erased. The weight of that understanding followed him back to the workshop, where the boulder now seemed less like raw material and more like an accomplice in a long act of concealment. He stood before it as the light faded, thinking of the anonymous hands that had carved its interior, the care with which they had sealed their pouch against a future they could not control. He had taken the first step in breaking their protection, and the responsibility of what came next pressed down on him more heavily than the stone ever could. The workshop had taken on the air of a temporary laboratory. What had once been a place of blunt force and grinding noise now lay arranged with almost clinical precision, the long table scrubbed clean, the tools lined up not by habit but by function. The sculptor moved among them with a care he had never needed before, aware that this was no longer about shaping stone, but about safeguarding something whose meaning he only dimly understood. The leather pouch remained hidden in the cabinet for most of the morning while he prepared, as though keeping it out of sight might delay the moment when he would have to confront its contents. He began by setting up lights, bright and steady, arranged so that no single shadow could obscure the surface he was about to expose. He calibrated the old digital camera he normally used to document finished sculptures, now repurposed to record the process in as much detail as its aging sensor could manage. He told himself that thoroughness was a form of respect, that the more carefully he documented, the less likely he was to lose something irreplaceable through ignorance. When he finally retrieved the pouch, he carried it as one might carry a sleeping child, cradling its weight against his chest. Up close, under the unforgiving glare of the lamps, its condition was both better and worse than he had expected. The leather had not cracked apart, yet it bore the scars of immense age, its surface uneven where oils had migrated and dried, where the resin that once sealed it had flowed into every crevice before setting like stone. The symbols were clearer here, not decorative but purposeful, pressed so deeply that they had altered the hide's very structure. He photographed every detail, then began the delicate task of softening the hardened resin. There were no chemical baths or professional equipment at his disposal, only patience and the steady application of controlled heat from a low-powered gun he normally used to cure finishes. The resin responded reluctantly, its surface turning from brittle to faintly pliant in small patches. He worked in millimeters, scraping away layers with a scalpel so sharp it seemed almost to hum when it touched the ancient coating. The hours passed unnoticed. The world beyond the workshop narrowed to the gleam of steel against amber, to the quiet flaking sound of centuries-old material yielding at last. As he progressed, the original seams of the pouch emerged, stitched with a skill that was all the more striking for its simplicity. Whoever had made this had not relied on ornament or excess. Every element served a purpose, from the tightness of the stitches to the way the resin had been poured to cover them. When the last of the hardened seal gave way, the opening did not spring apart as he half expected. It relaxed, slowly, the leather creasing as though waking from a long sleep. He paused, heart hammering, then parted the seam just enough to peer inside. There was no glitter of metal, no reassuring clink of coin. Instead, he saw a mass of muted shapes wrapped in a substance that might once have been flesh or fiber, now transformed into something closer to parchment by the long years in darkness. He widened the opening carefully and slid a gloved hand inside, not to remove anything but to feel the texture of the wrappings. They were firm, yet not brittle, preserved by the resin and the sealed chamber in a state that defied his expectations. Beneath them he could sense the contours of solid objects, angular and heavy, arranged with deliberate order. He withdrew his hand, resisting the urge to explore further without witnesses or guidance. It was in that moment that the full truth of the situation settled on him. This was not a personal hoard, not the savings of a forgotten traveler or the spoils of some long-ago crime. The care with which the items had been wrapped and sealed spoke of ritual, of reverence. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the workshop's temperature, and everything to do with the sudden awareness that he had crossed a boundary that was not his to define. He reached for the phone on the bench and began searching for contacts he had never expected to need. The nearest university was 2 hours away, its anthropology department small but reputable. He drafted an email, then erased it, then drafted it again, struggling to find words that would convey urgency without sounding delusional. In the end, he kept it simple, attaching a single photograph of the unopened pouch and describing, in the plainest terms he could manage, the circumstances of its discovery. The reply came sooner than he had dared hope. A professor wrote back asking for more images, for clarification on the material and the exact location where the stone had been found. The tone was cautious but unmistakably interested. He sent what he could without fully revealing the contents, aware that once the academic machinery began to turn, control over the narrative would no longer belong solely to him. It was, as he was preparing those images, that the phone rang again. The caller did not bother with pleasantries this time. He wanted to visit the workshop, he said, to see how the project was coming along. The implication was clear. The sculptor felt the room shrink around him, the pouch in the cabinet suddenly a liability that glowed in his imagination like a signal flare. He made an excuse about equipment failure and promised to call back within a day with an update. When he ended the call, he found that his hands were shaking too badly to hold the phone steady. The rest of the afternoon he spent oscillating between the pouch and the boulder, documenting everything he could think of, backing up files to a battered external drive, making copies of his notes and hiding them in different parts of the workshop. He had never considered himself paranoid, yet now he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the interest in this stone had less to do with art than with whatever it had concealed. As evening fell, he stepped back from the table and looked at the open pouch, its contents still wrapped and silent. He had not yet uncovered a single item, yet already the weight of responsibility pressed on him like the stone itself. The decision to involve specialists had been the right one, he knew that, but it also marked the point at which he could no longer retreat into ignorance. Whatever lay inside this pouch was about to change the course of his life, and perhaps the understanding of a history that had been deliberately buried. By the time the experts arrived, the sculptor had already begun to feel as though his workshop had slipped beyond the boundaries of his ordinary life and into a strange interim space where past and present pressed uncomfortably close together. The pouch lay sealed again, wrapped in layers of clean cloth and resting inside a padded crate he had improvised from scrap wood and foam. He had done everything he could to stabilize the temperature and humidity, closing off vents, turning the old heater on and off in short cycles to keep the air from drifting too far in either direction. It was a crude approximation of professional conservation, but it was all he had. The professor from the university arrived first, a woman with tired eyes and a voice that grew steadier the longer she studied the photographs he had sent. She was followed by a museum conservator whose movements were so deliberate they seemed rehearsed, and then by a representative from the state office responsible for cultural heritage. They filled the workshop with the quiet authority of people accustomed to being summoned by unusual finds, yet each of them paused when they saw the boulder, the slit still faintly visible beneath the canvas. None of them needed to be told that this was no ordinary discovery. They began with questions rather than actions, listening as the sculptor recounted the sequence of events, from the mysterious commission to the hollow sound of the first strike. He spoke more than he had in years, his words tumbling over one another as he tried to convey the sense of unease that had settled over him since that morning. The conservator took notes, nodding occasionally, while the professor's gaze returned again and again to the place where the stone had been opened, as though she could already picture the hands that had shaped it. Only when his account was finished did they approach the crate. The pouch was unwrapped with a care that bordered on ritual, the cloth folded back layer by layer until the dark leather lay exposed to the light once more. The professor bent close, her breath catching audibly as she traced the symbols with a gloved finger. She murmured names he did not recognize, referencing patterns from tribes that had once occupied these mountains long before any road had cut through the gorge. The conservator examined the resin seal and the stitching, commenting quietly on the techniques employed, on the unusual combination of materials that had allowed the pouch to survive for so long. There was no talk of market value or potential display. Their interest lay elsewhere, in the story implied by the craftsmanship and the implications of a sealed cache hidden inside living rock. They documented the pouch thoroughly before opening it, photographing, measuring, scanning with portable equipment to assess the interior without disturbing it. The sculptor stood back, suddenly conscious of how improvised his own efforts had been. Yet the professionals did not dismiss him. They spoke to him as a collaborator rather than a bystander, acknowledging that without his patience and restraint, the pouch might have been lost to careless curiosity. When they finally parted the leather and peeled back the ancient wrappings, the room seemed to contract around the table. The contents emerged slowly, objects of stone and metal arranged in a precise order that had clearly been established with care. The professor identified the shapes almost immediately as ceremonial items, tools not of labor but of meaning, carved and polished according to traditions that had not been practiced openly in this region for more than 300 years. She spoke then of a mountain people whose settlements had once traced the high valleys, whose trade routes and seasonal migrations were recorded only in fragments of colonial journals and the oral histories of distant descendants. According to those records, many of their sacred objects had been destroyed or seized during periods of forced relocation, their spiritual heritage scattered or erased. The existence of a cache like this, sealed so completely that even centuries of erosion and industrial disturbance had not betrayed it, suggested a deliberate act of preservation undertaken in the face of imminent loss. The conservator explained how the resin, likely derived from local trees, had created an airtight barrier, preventing moisture and microorganisms from degrading the organic materials. The rock itself had provided insulation from temperature fluctuations, turning the mountain into a vault more effective than any built structure of the time. It was a solution born of desperation and ingenuity, and it had worked far beyond the lifespan of those who had conceived it. They traced the probable journey of the boulder, reconstructing a sequence of natural and human events that had carried it from its original resting place in a cliff face down into the valley. An ancient landslide, perhaps triggered by a storm or an earthquake, could have torn the stone free, burying it beneath debris. Decades later, road construction or quarrying would have unearthed it, moving it from one pile of rubble to another until it lost all connection to its origin. By the time it reached the sculptor's workshop, it was nothing more than a convenient mass of granite to be reshaped or discarded. The conversation turned inevitably to the present. The professor emphasized the importance of involving representatives of the descendant community, explaining that interpretation and decision-making could not be done in isolation from the people whose ancestors had created the cache. The state official outlined the legal framework that governed such finds, noting that while the land had changed hands many times, cultural patrimony could not be claimed by whoever happened to possess the physical object. The sculptor listened, absorbing words like repatriation and consultation, realizing that the pouch and its contents were no longer his to worry over alone. At the same time, a fresh anxiety surfaced. He told them about the commission, about the caller who had insisted on discretion and now wanted to visit. The room fell quiet at that, the professionals exchanging glances that did not require translation. They advised him to document every interaction, to keep records of calls and messages, to avoid any private meetings until the situation was clarified. The state representative spoke of cases where individuals had attempted to claim ownership of artifacts through questionable contracts or pressure, and of the need to establish a clear chain of custody before anyone else could assert a right to the discovery. As they prepared to leave, arrangements were made to transport the pouch to the university for further analysis under controlled conditions. The sculptor felt a pang at the thought of it leaving his workshop, as though a chapter were closing before he had fully understood it. Yet, he also felt relief. The burden he had been carrying alone would soon be shared by those better equipped to bear it. When the doors finally closed behind the experts, the workshop felt emptier than it had in days. The boulder remained, its hollow heart exposed, a mute witness to everything that had been said. The sculptor stood before it long after the last car had disappeared down the road, aware that the discovery he had made by accident was now part of a much larger story, one that would test not only his patience but his integrity in ways he had never anticipated. The days that followed the departure of the experts were among the most unsettled the sculptor had ever known. His workshop, stripped of the pouch that had become its quiet center, felt hollow in a way the boulder's empty chamber could not fully explain. The stone still loomed where it had been delivered, but it no longer felt like a commission. It had become a monument to something he had been allowed to touch only briefly before it was taken beyond his reach, and the waiting that came after proved more exhausting than the discovery itself. Arrangements for the formal handover of the artifacts were communicated through careful, measured emails from the university. They spoke of consultation with representatives of the descendant community, of protocols to ensure that the objects would be returned in a manner that respected both cultural practice and legal obligation. The sculptor read each message more than once, lingering over phrases that hinted at ceremony and reconciliation rather than mere transfer of property. He was told that he would be invited to attend when the time came, not as an owner or benefactor, but as the person who had uncovered what had been lost. While those preparations unfolded in academic offices and community halls far from the valley, his own life grew steadily more complicated. The caller, whose name he still did not know, had not been silent. Messages accumulated on his phone, each more insistent than the last. They began as polite requests for updates and hardened into thinly veiled demands, reminders of contracts signed and obligations unmet. When he stopped answering altogether, the calls were replaced by visits. The first time the man appeared at the workshop door, the sculptor almost did not recognize him from the smooth voice he had imagined. He was younger than expected, dressed in expensive casual clothes that looked out of place against the backdrop of peeling paint and stone dust. He spoke calmly, but his eyes moved constantly, taking in the boulder, the tools, the locked cabinets. He asked to see the progress of the sculpture, to be reassured that his investment had not been wasted. The sculptor told him that the project was on hold pending structural assessments, words borrowed from the language of the experts. The man's smile did not waver, but it tightened at the edges, revealing irritation beneath the polish. He hinted at financial consequences, at the inconvenience caused by delays, at the ease with which misunderstandings could be cleared up if the sculptor were more forthcoming. When he left, the workshop felt smaller, the walls pressing in as though they had overheard too much. Local gossip traveled faster than any official notice. People in town had seen the university vehicles, the unfamiliar faces, the guarded activity around the workshop. The sculptor noticed a change in the way neighbors greeted him at the grocery store, a new curiosity that edged into conversations that had once been safely mundane. Someone had posted a photograph online, taken from across the street, showing the boulder being examined by strangers in gloves. Comments speculated wildly about hidden treasure and secret deals, the truth lost beneath a tide of assumption. In the midst of this, the invitation finally arrived. The handover would take place at a cultural center maintained by the descendant community, a modest building set among trees on land that had once been part of their ancestral range. The university provided directions and a time, emphasizing that the event would not be publicized beyond those directly involved. It was not meant as a spectacle, they wrote, but as a moment of restoration. He drove there early, the road winding through valleys that felt suddenly charged with meaning. Every ridge and stream he passed had been traversed by people whose connection to this land had outlasted even the stone that had hidden their relics. When he arrived, he found a gathering already in progress. There were elders whose lined faces carried a gravity that silenced casual speech, young people standing with quiet attentiveness, university staff setting up recording equipment with a respect that bordered on reverence. The pouch lay at the center of the room, now enclosed in a clear protective case. Its contents had been carefully unwrapped and stabilized, yet they remained arranged as they had been discovered, a cluster of stone and metal forms whose significance he could sense without fully understanding. The professor greeted him with a nod that conveyed both gratitude and restraint, as though acknowledging that his presence was part of the story, but not its culmination. One of the elders spoke at length, recounting the fragmentary history that had been preserved in oral tradition. There had been stories of sacred objects hidden in the mountains, of a last act of defiance before the community was scattered. Over generations, those stories had become symbolic, their literal truth fading as the people adapted to new lives and new places. The existence of the pouch transformed those stories from metaphor back into fact, confirming that their ancestors had not surrendered everything, that they had found a way to leave something behind for a future they would never see. As the ceremony progressed, the sculptor felt a tension he had not known how to articulate begin to ease. The objects were addressed not as curiosities or academic specimens, but as relations returned from exile. The words spoken were not translated for him, yet their cadence carried meaning beyond language, a rhythm of acknowledgement and welcome that needed no explanation. The caller's shadow hovered over his thoughts even here, and when he felt a presence behind him, he turned abruptly, only to find the state representative who had visited his workshop. She told him quietly that the man had attempted to assert a claim over the artifacts that morning, citing his contract and the origin of the stone. Legal staff had intervened, presenting documentation that established the cultural and historical status of the items and the impropriety of any private ownership. The man had left in anger, she said, promising further action, but for the moment he had been kept at bay. The ceremony concluded with the formal transfer of responsibility to the community. The pouch, now empty of its burden, was also returned, its role as guardian acknowledged alongside the objects it had preserved. The sculptor was invited to stand with the elders as the final words were spoken, and in that moment he felt a sense of belonging he had not known since childhood, a recognition that his solitary labor had intersected with a collective memory larger than any individual life. As people dispersed, some approached him with questions, not about money or contracts, but about the stone, about the moment of discovery, about what it had felt like to reach into the mountain and touch the past. He answered as honestly as he could, describing not triumph but responsibility, not excitement, but the quiet weight of knowing that he had been trusted by accident with something precious. When he left the cultural center, the sun was sinking behind the hills, casting long shadows across the parking lot. He sat in his car for a long time before starting the engine, aware that whatever conflict lay ahead with the caller, whatever legal complexities might yet unfold, something irreversible had already occurred. He had chosen, publicly and without hesitation, to return what had been hidden, and in doing so had aligned himself with a history that would not be undone by contracts or threats. When the sculptor returned to his workshop after the ceremony, the building greeted him with a stillness that felt different from any silence he had known before. It was not the hollow quiet that had followed the removal of the pouch, nor the tense expectancy that had hung in the air while the experts worked and the caller's shadow loomed. It was something closer to completion, a pause after a long breath, as though the space itself had been waiting for him to come back, having set things right. The boulder still occupied the center of the room, its exposed cavity a dark oval where centuries of concealment had ended. For the first time since the commission had begun, he allowed himself to approach it without dread. He ran his fingers along the edge of the opening, feeling the hardened resin that still clung to the stone like the last traces of a vanished craft. The cavity was empty now, yet it no longer felt violated. It felt fulfilled, its purpose completed at last. In the days that followed, the consequences of the discovery unfolded in a steady, unhurried rhythm. Letters arrived from the state office formally closing the matter of custody, thanking him for his cooperation and confirming that no claim from the mysterious collector had been recognized. He learned through a mutual acquaintance that the man's attempt to assert ownership had collapsed under scrutiny, that his contract had been deemed irrelevant to objects of cultural patrimony. There were rumors of an investigation into how he had come to know about the stone in the first place, though the details were sparse and the sculptor felt no desire to pursue them. The town, which had always seemed content to let him exist at its margins, began to look at him with altered eyes. The local paper ran a feature on the return of the artifacts, careful to center the story on the descendant community, but acknowledging his role in their recovery. Neighbors, who had once nodded in passing, now stopped to ask questions, not about wealth or fame, but about the stone, about what it had felt like to find something that rewrote a piece of the valley's past. He answered patiently, though he knew no description could fully convey the strange blend of fear and reverence that had accompanied the moment of discovery. One afternoon, he received an invitation from the cultural center. The elders wished to commission a piece from him, not as a commercial transaction, but as a collaborative act, something that could stand in the center as a reminder of both loss and continuity. The subject was left to his discretion, with the gentle suggestion that it reflect not the hidden chamber itself, but the idea of endurance that had allowed their heritage to survive. He stood for a long time in the workshop after reading the letter, his gaze drifting from the boulder to the rows of half-finished sculptures that lined the walls. For years he had carved in isolation, guided only by his own instincts and the stubborn belief that stone carried stories worth hearing. Now, that belief had been affirmed in a way he could never have predicted, and it demanded a response worthy of its gravity. He began by selecting a smaller block from the remnants of the boulder, a piece that had broken away naturally during the opening of the cavity. It felt right that the new work should be born from the same stone that had guarded the pouch, that its material continuity mirrored the continuity of the story it was meant to tell. He cleaned it carefully, removing every trace of dust and resin until the surface gleamed with quiet potential. As he worked, he found that his relationship with the stone had shifted. He no longer approached it solely as a sculptor seeking form, but as a listener attuned to the echoes of past hands. The sound of his mallet seemed deeper, less intrusive, as though he were tapping into a dialogue rather than imposing his will. He carved slowly, shaping not a literal representation but an abstraction of shelter, a curve that suggested both a mountain's embrace and the protective hollow that had preserved the artifacts. The piece grew over weeks, its lines smoothing into a form that resisted simple classification. Those who saw it in progress struggled to name it, and he offered no explanation, content to let the stone speak in its own way. When it was finished, he transported it to the cultural center himself, setting it in place under the guidance of the elders. They did not evaluate it as art in the conventional sense, but as a gesture, a bridge between what had been hidden and what was now openly acknowledged. In quieter moments, he reflected on how narrowly his life might have missed this turning. Had he been less patient, less willing to listen to the stone, the pouch might have been shattered by careless blows. Had he been more desperate for money, he might have handed everything over to the caller without question, erasing centuries of preservation in a single transaction. Instead, he found himself in a position he had never sought, regarded not as a curiosity or a cautionary tale, but as someone who had acted with integrity when it mattered. The workshop began to fill with new commissions, not from collectors seeking to own something rare, but from people interested in what his work represented. He accepted selectively, aware that the pace he had once maintained out of necessity no longer served him. He still struggled with bills, still counted dollars at the grocery store, yet the anxiety that had once hollowed out his days was softened by a sense of purpose that no invoice could diminish. On a late autumn evening, long after the town had settled into darkness, he stood alone in the workshop with the lights off, the moonlight tracing silver lines across the floor. The boulder was gone now, returned to a quarry to be crushed for aggregate, its role in the story complete. Yet, in its absence, he could still feel the shape of its presence, the way it had altered the trajectory of his life. He closed the door behind him and stepped outside, the cold air carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. The mountains rose in shadow against the starless sky, immense and patient as ever. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he did not feel dwarfed by their silence. He felt accompanied by it, as though the land itself acknowledged the small part he had played in restoring a fragment of what had been taken. He walked home with a steady stride, knowing that whatever stone he chose to carve next, he would never again strike blindly, for he had learned that beneath even the hardest surface might lie a story waiting to be returned to the world. If this story kept you on edge until the very end, make sure you subscribe right now so you don't miss what happens in the next one. New discoveries, lost secrets, and real stories from the shadows are already waiting for you. Watch the next video, explore the others on the channel, and share this story with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do.